History of the World by J. M. Roberts, Book 2, The First Civilizations, Chapter 4, Intruders and Invaders, The Dark Ages of the Ancient Near East. Metallurgical demands help to explain another innovation, a new and increasingly complex interregional and long distance trade. It is one of those complicating interactions which seem to be giving the ancient world a certain unity just before its disruption at the end of the second millennium BC. Tin, for example, so important a commodity, had to be brought from Mesopotamia and Afghanistan as well as Anatolia to what we should now call manufacturing centers. The copper of Cyprus was another widely traded commodity, and the search for more of it gave Europe, at the margins of ancient history, though she was, a new importance. Mine shafts in what was to be Yugoslavia were sunk 60 and 70 feet below ground to get at copper even before 4000 BC. Perhaps it is not surprising that some European peoples later came to display high levels of metallurgical skill, notably in the beating of large sheets of bronze and in the shaping of iron, a much more difficult material to work than bronze until temperatures high enough to cast it were available. Long range commerce turns on transport. At first, the carriage of goods was a matter of asses and donkeys. The domestication of camels in the middle of the second millennium BC made possible the caravan trade of Asia and the Arabian Peninsula, which was later to seem to be of ageless antiquity and opened an environment hitherto almost impenetrable, the waterless desert. Except among the nomadic people, wheeled transport probably had only local importance, given the poor quality of early roads. Early carts were drawn by oxen or asses. They may have been in service in Mesopotamia about 3000 BC, in Syria around 2250 BC, in Anatolia 2 or 300 years later, and in mainland Greece about 1500 BC. For goods in quantity, water transport was already likely to be cheaper and simpler than transport by land. This was to be a constant of economic life until the coming of the steam railway, long before caravans began to bring up to Mesopotamia and Egypt the gums and raisins of the South Arabian coasts. Ships were carrying them up the Red Sea, and merchants were moving back and forth in trading vessels across the Aegean. Understandably, it was in maritime technology that some of the most important advances in transport were made. We now know that Neolithic peoples could make long journeys by sea in dug out canoes, and there is even some evidence of navigation from the 7th millennium. The Egyptians of the third dynasty had put a sail on a sea-going ship, the central mast, and square sail were the beginning of the seamanship relying on anything but human energy. Improvements of rigging came slowly over the next 2 millennia. It had been thought that these made some approach to the fore and aft rigging, which was necessary if ships were to sail closer to the wind. But for the most part, the ships of antiquity were square rigged. Because of this, the direction of prevailing winds was decisive in setting patterns of seaborne communication. The only other source of energy was human. The invention of the oar is an early one, and it provided the motive power for long sea crossings as well as for close handling. It seems likely, though, that oars were used more frequently in warships and sail in what it is at a very early date possible to call merchantmen. By the 13th century BC, ships capable of carrying more than 200 copper ingots were sailing about the eastern Mediterranean, and within a few centuries more, some of these ships were being fitted with watertight decks. Even in recent times, goods have been exchanged or bartered, and no doubt this was what trade meant for most of antiquity. Yet a great step was taken when money was invented. This seems to have happened in Mesopotamia, where values of account were being given in measures of grain or silver before 2000 BC. Copper ingots seem to have been treated as monetary units throughout the Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age. The first officially sealed means of exchange which survives comes from Cappadocia in the form of ingots of silver of the late 3rd millennium BC. This was a true metal currency. Yet, although money is an important invention and one which was to spread, we have to wait until the 8th century BC for the Assyrians to have a silver standard for the first coins. Refined monetary devices, and Mesopotamia had a credit system and bills of exchange in early times, may help to promote trade, but they are not indispensable. Peoples in the ancient world could get along without them. The Phoenicians, a trading people of legendary skill and acumen, did not have a currency until the 6th century BC. Egypt, a centrally controlled economy and of impressive wealth, did not adopt a coinage until 2 centuries after that, and the Celtic Europe, for all its trade in metal goods, did not coin money until 2 centuries later still. Meanwhile, men exchanged goods without money, though it is hard to be sure quite what this means. Although there was an important rise in the volume of goods moved about the world by 1000 BC or so, not all of this was what would now be termed trade. Economic organization in ancient times is, for a long time, very obscure. Any specialized function, pottery making, for example, implies a machinery which, on the one hand, distributes its products and, on the other, ensures subsistence to the specialist by redistributing to him and his fellows the food they need to survive, and perhaps other goods. But this does not require trade, even in the form of barter. Many peoples in historic times have been observed operating such distributions through their chiefs. These men presided over a common store, owning, in a sense, everything the community possessed, and doling out such shares from it as were required to keep society working smoothly. This may be what lay behind the centralization of goods and supplies in Sumerian temples. It would also explain the importance of the recording and sealing of consignments deposited there, and hence the early association of writing and accounting. As for economic exchange between communities, confident generalizations about its earliest stages is even more hazardous. Once into the era of historical record, we can see many activities going on which involve the transfer of commodities, not all of them aimed at monetary gain. Payment of tribute, symbolic or diplomatic gifts between rulers, votive offerings were some of the forms it took. We should not rush to be over definite. Right now, to the 19th century AD, the Chinese Empire conceived its foreign trade in terms of tribute from the outside world, and the pharaohs had a way of translating trade with the Aegean into similar notions, to judge by tomb paintings. In the ancient world, such transactions might include the transfer of standard objects such as tripods or vessels of a certain weight or rings of uniform size, which therefore present at an early date some of the characteristics of currency. Sometimes such things were useful, sometimes they were merely tokens. All that is wholly certain that the movement of commodities increased, and that much of this increase in the end took the form of the profitable exchanges we now think of as commerce. New towns must have helped such changes. They sprang all over the world and the old Near East, no doubt in part because of the population growth. They registered the successive exploitation of agricultural possibilities, but also the growing parasitism. The literary tradition of the alienation of countrymen from the city is already there in the Old Testament. Yet, city life also offered a new intensity of cultural creativity, a new acceleration of civilization, of which one sign is spreading of literacy. In about 2000 BC, literacy was still largely confined to the river valley civilizations and the areas they influenced. Cuneiform had spread throughout Mesopotamia, where two or three languages were written in it. In Egypt, the monumental inscriptions were hieroglyphic, and day to day writing was done on papyrus in a simplified form called hieratic. 1,000 years or so later, the picture had changed. Literate peoples were then to be found all over the Near East and in Crete and Greece too. Cuneiform had been adapted to yet more languages with great success. Even the Egyptian government adopted it for its diplomacy. Other scripts were being invented too. One, in Crete, takes us to the edge of modernity, for it reveals a people in about 1500 BC whose language was basically Greek. With the adoption of a Semitic alphabet, the Phoenician, the medium of the first Western literature, was in existence by about 800 BC, and so perhaps was its first surviving expression in what were later called the works of Homer. Such themes make nonsense of chronology. They register changes lost to sight if history is pinned too closely to specific countries. Yet, individual countries and their peoples, though subject to general forces and in more and more frequent contact, also become increasingly distinct. Literacy pins down tradition. In its turn, tradition expresses communal self consciousness. Presumably, tribes and peoples have always felt their identity. Such awareness is much strengthened when states take on more continuing and institutionalized forms. The dissolution of empires into more viable units is a familiar story from Sumer to modern times, but some areas emerge time and time again as enduring nuclei of tradition. Even in the second millennium BC, states are getting more solid and show greater staying power. They were still far from achieving that extensive and continuing control of their peoples, whose possibilities have only fully been revealed in modern times. Yet, even in the most ancient records, there seems to be an unchecked trend towards a greater regularity in government and greater institutionalizing of power. Kings surround themselves with bureaucracies, and tax collectors find the resources for larger and larger enterprises. Law becomes a widely accepted idea. Wherever it penetrates, there is a limitation, even if at first only implicit, of the power of the individual and an increase of that of the lawgiver. Above all, the state expresses itself in military power. The problem of feeding, equipping, and administrating standing professional armies is solved by 1000 BC. When such things happen, the story of governmental and social institutions begin to escape from the general categories of early civilization. In spite of a new cosmopolitanism made possible by easier intercourse and cross fertilizing, societies take very diverse paths. In the life of the mind, the most conspicuous expression of diversity is religion. While some have discerned in the pre classical era a tendency towards simpler monotheistic systems, the more obvious fact is a huge and varied pantheon of local and specialized deities, mostly coexisting tolerantly, with only an occasional indication that one god is jealous of his distinction. There is a new scope for differentiation in other expressions of culture too. Before civilization began, art had already established itself as an autonomous activity, not necessarily linked to religion or magic. Often so, linked though it continued to be. The first literature has already been mentioned, and of other sides of the mind, we also begin to see something. There is the possibility of play. Gaming boards appear in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Crete. Perhaps men were already gambling. Kings and noblemen hunted with passion, and in their palaces were entertained by musicians and dancers. Among sports, boxing seems to go back into the Bronze Age Crete, an island where a unique sport of bull leaping was also practiced. In such matters, it is more obvious than anywhere else that we need not pay much heed to chronology, far less to particular dates, even when we can be sure of them. The notion is an individual civilization is less and less helpful over the area with which we have so far been concerned too. There is too much interplay for it to bear the weight it can do in Egypt and Sumer. Somewhere between about 1500 and 800 BC, big changes took place which ought not to be allowed to slip through the mesh of a net woven to catch the history of the first two great civilizations. In the confused, turbulent Near East and Eastern Mediterranean of the centuries round 1000 BC, a new world, different from that of Sumer and the Old Kingdom, was in the making. Early civilized life in the Aegean. A new interplay of cultures brought many changes to the peoples on the fringe of the Near East, but civilization in the Aegean islands was rooted in Neolithic as it was elsewhere. The first metal object found in Greece, a copper bead, has been dated to about 4700 BC, and European as well as Asian stimuli may have been at work. Crete is the largest of the Greek islands. Several centuries before 2000 BC's, towns with a regular layout were being built there by an advanced people who had been there through the Neolithic times. They may have had contacts with Anatolia, which spurred them to exceptional achievements, but the evidence is indecisive. They could well have derived a civilization for themselves. At any rate, for about 1,000 years, they built the houses and tombs by which their culture is distinguished, and these did not change much in style. By about 2500 BC, there were important towns and villages on the coasts, built of stone and brick. Their inhabitants practiced metalworking and made attractive seals and jewels. At this stage, that is to say, the Cretans shared much of the culture of mainland Greece and Asia Minor. They exchanged goods with other Asian communities. There then came a change. About 500 years later, they began to build the series of great palaces, which are the monuments of what we call Minoan civilization. The greatest of them, Knossos, was first built about 1900 BC. Nothing quite as impressive appears anywhere else among the islands, and it exercised a cultural hegemony over more or less the whole of the Aegean. Minoan is a curious name. It is taken from the king of Minos, who, although celebrated in legend, may never have existed. Much later, the Greeks believed or said that he was a great king in Crete who lived at Knossos, parleyed with the gods, and married Pasiphae, the daughter of the sun. Her monstrous offspring, the Minotaur, devoured sacrificial youths and maids, sent as tribute from Greece at the heart of a labyrinth eventually penetrated successfully by the hero Theseus, who slew him. This is a rich and suggestive theme and has excited scholars who believe it can throw light on Cretan civilization. But there is no proof that King Minos ever existed. It may be that, as legend suggests, there was more than one of that name, or that his name was a titular identification of several Cretan rulers. He is one of those fascinating figures who, like King Arthur, remain just beyond the borders of history but inside those of mythology. Minoan then simply means the civilization of people who lived in Bronze Age Crete. It has no other connotation. This civilization lasted some 600 years, but only the outlines of a history can be put together. They reveal a people living in towns linked in some dependence on a monarchy at Knossos. For 3 or 4 centuries, they prosper, exchanging goods with Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Greek mainland, and subsisting on a native agriculture. It may have been this which explains Minoan civilization's leap forward. Crete seems then, as today, to have been better for the production of olives and wines, two of the great staples of the later Mediterranean agriculture, than either the other islands or mainland Greece. It seems likely too that she raised large numbers of sheep and exported wool. Whatever its precise forms, Crete experienced an important agricultural advance in late Neolithic times, which led not only to better cereal growing but, above all, to the cultivation of the olive and wine. They could be grown where grains could not, and their discovery changed the possibilities of the Mediterranean life. Immediately, they permitted a larger population. On this, much else could then be built because new human resources were available, but it also made new demands for organization and government, for the regulation of a more complex agriculture and the handling of its produce. Whether or not this explains the appearance of Minoan civilization, its peak came about 1600 BC. A century or so later, the Minoan palaces were destroyed. The mystery of this end is tantalizing. At about the same time, the major towns of the Aegean islands were destroyed by fire too. There had been earthquakes in the past. Perhaps this was another of them. Recent scholarship identifies a great eruption in the island of Thera at a suitable time. It could have been accompanied by tidal waves and earthquakes in Crete, 70 miles away, and followed by the descent of clouds of ash which blighted Cretan fields. Some people have preferred to think of a rising against the rulers who lived in the palaces. Some have discerned signs of a new invasion or postulated some great raid from the sea, which carried off booty and prisoners, destroying a political power forever by the damage it inflicted and leaving no new settlers behind. None of these can be conclusively established. It is only possible to guess about what happened, and the view which does least violence to the lack of evidence is that there was a natural cataclysm originating in Thera, which broke the back of the Minoan civilization. Whatever the cause, this was not the end of early civilization in Crete, for Knossos was occupied for another century or so by people from the mainland. Nevertheless, though there were still some fairly prosperous times to come, the ascendancy of indigenous civilization of Crete was, in effect, over. For a time, it seems, Knossos still prospered. Then, early in the 14th century BC, it too was destroyed by fire. This had happened before, but this time it was not rebuilt. So ends the story of early Cretan civilization. Fortunately, its salient characteristics are easier to understand than the detail of its history. The most obvious is its close relationship with the sea. More than 1,000 years later, Greek tradition said that Minoan Crete was a great naval power exercising political hegemony in the Aegean throughout her fleet. This idea has been much blown upon by modern scholars anxious to reduce what they believe to be an anachronistic conception to more plausible proportions, and it certainly seems misleading to see behind this tradition the sort of political power later exercised through their navies by such states as 5th century Athens or 19th century Great Britain. The Minoans may have had a lot of ships, but they were unlikely to be specialized at this early date, and there is no hope in the Bronze Age of drawing a line between trade, piracy, and counter piracy in their employment. Probably there was no Cretan navy in an institutional sense at all. Nevertheless, the Minoans felt sufficiently sure of the protection of sea given to them. And this must have implied some confidence in their ability to dominate the approaches to the natural harbors, most of which are on the north coast, to live in towns without fortifications built near to the shore on only slightly elevated ground. We do not have to look for a Cretan Nelson among their defenders. That would be silly, but we can envisage a Cretan Hawkins or Drake trading, freebooting, and protecting the home base. The Minoans thus exploited sea as other peoples exploited their own natural environments. The result was an interchange of products and ideas which shows once more how civilization can accelerate where there is the possibility of cross fertilization. Minoans had close connections with Syria before 1550 BC and traded as far west as Sicily, perhaps further. Someone took their goods up the Adriatic coasts. Even more important was their penetration of Greece. The Minoans may well have been the most important single conduit through which the goods and ideas of the earliest civilizations reached Bronze Age Europe. Certain Cretan products begin to turn up in Egypt in the second millennium BC, and this was a major outlet. The art of the New Kingdom shows Cretan influence. There was even, some scholars think, an Egyptian resident for some time at Knossos, presumably to watch over well established interests. And it has been argued that Minoans fought with the Egyptians against the Hyksos. Cretan vases and metal goods have been found at several places in Asia Minor. These are the things which survive, but it has been asserted that a wide range of other products timber, grapes, oil, wood, metal vases, and even opium were supplied by Minoans to the mainland. In return, they took metal from Asia Minor, alabaster from Egypt, ostrich eggs from Libya. It was already a complex trading world. Together with the prosperous agriculture, it made possible a civilization of considerable solidity, long able to recover from natural disaster, as the repeated rebuilding of the palace at Knossos seems to show. The palaces are the finest relics of Minoan civilization, but the towns were well built too and had elaborate piped drains and sewers. This was technical achievement of a higher order. Early in the sequence of palaces at Knossos, the bathing and lavatory provision is on a scale unsurpassed before Roman times. Other cultural achievement was less practical, though artistic, rather than intellectual. Minoans seem to have taken their mathematics from Egypt and left it at that. Their religion went under with them, apparently leaving nothing to the future. But the Minoans had an important contribution to make to the style of another civilization on the Greek mainland. Art embodied Minoan civilization at its highest and remains its most spectacular legacy. Its genius was pictorial and reached a climax in palace frescoes of startling liveliness and movement. Here is a really original style, influential across the seas, in Egypt and in Greece, through other palatial arts too, notably the working of gems and precious metals. It was to shape fashion elsewhere.